"I can't have children," Fat Girl said in tears, but the Hell's Angel made her pregnant in 3 days. A plus-sized waitress wipes down a lonely diner counter, whispering the same hopeless prayer she's said for years. "God, why won't you give me a child?" But one stormy night, the bell above the door rings, and in walks a bleeding, tattooed biker just out of prison. She's afraid. He's broken. 2 people the world's already thrown away, now trapped together by a desert storm that won't let up. When he mutters, "Maybe we're both the unwanted kind," something shifts inside her. Days later, her hands shake over a pregnancy test. Impossible. Positive. The doctor said she never could. The town will never believe it. And the man who made it happen? He's hiding a past that could destroy them both. As thunder rolls again over the Nevada desert, was it a miracle or a warning? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The fluorescent lights of Ruby's Diner buzzed overhead as Evelyn May wiped down the chrome counter for what felt like the 100th time that night. Her reflection in the polished surface showed a woman worn thin by years of late shifts and lonely drives home. But her eyes still held a gentle warmth that even the harshest midnight hours couldn't dim. Outside, rain pelted against the large windows, transforming the neon signs into watery streaks of pink and blue. The clock above the kitchen door read 11:45 p.m., and the diner was empty except for the usual night crew and a few truckers nursing their coffee cups. "I swear, that woman's never going to find herself a man if she doesn't do something about her size," whispered Tanya, one of the younger waitresses, to the cook. Her voice carried across the quiet diner, sharp as a knife and just as cutting. Evelyn's hand paused mid-wipe, her chest tightening, but she kept her head down and continued her work. She'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Instead, she focused on the circular motions of her cleaning cloth, watching the surface shine beneath her careful attention. "Did you hear about her last date?" Jenny, another waitress, chimed in. "Guy took one look at her and made some excuse about his mother being sick." The 2 women's laughter echoed off the tile walls. Ruby Haskins, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen like a storm cloud, her gray hair escaping from its neat bun. "Don't you 2 have tables to clean?" she barked, sending them scattering like startled birds. Evelyn gave Ruby a small, grateful smile. "You don't have to." "Hush," Ruby cut her off, but her voice was gentle. "Those girls wouldn't know real worth if it came with a price tag." She patted Evelyn's hand before heading back to the kitchen, leaving behind the faint scent of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The last hour of her shift crawled by, marked by the steady drumming of rain and the occasional rumble of trucks on the highway. Evelyn moved through her closing duties with practiced efficiency, refilling salt shakers, checking napkin dispensers, and making sure the coffee makers were clean for the morning crew. At 12:30 a.m., she hung up her apron and gathered her things from the small break room. Her umbrella, old and slightly bent, waited by the door like a faithful friend. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of semis idling in the far corner, their drivers probably catching some sleep before continuing their long hauls. The rain had picked up, forming small rivers in the cracked asphalt. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter and began her walk home, the umbrella offering little protection against the wind-driven drops. Her sensible shoes splashed through puddles as she made her way down the poorly lit street. Her trailer park sat a quarter-mile from the diner, a collection of homes that had seen better days but still housed people who tried their best to make them beautiful. Christmas lights hung year-round on some, while others displayed proud flower boxes despite the harsh desert climate. Evelyn's own trailer, number 17, was one of the smaller ones, with faded blue paint and a small wooden step that creaked when she climbed it. As she approached, a familiar shadow darted out from beneath the trailer. "There you are, Thomas," she said softly to the orange tabby cat who wound between her legs. She'd never officially adopted him. He'd just shown up one day and decided to stay. Like her, he seemed to understand what it meant to be left behind. Inside, the trailer was neat but worn. Family photos lined the walls, memories of parents long gone and siblings who'd moved away to bigger cities and better lives. Evelyn changed out of her damp clothes and prepared Thomas's dinner, setting the small bowl of cat food on the porch under the awning. Thunder rolled across the desert, closer now, making the thin walls of the trailer vibrate. Evelyn sat on her bed, the springs creaking beneath her weight, and did what she'd done every night for the past 15 years. She prayed. "Dear God," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I know I'm not much. I know I'm not pretty like Tanya or smart like my sister Sarah. I know my body's broken and I'll never have children of my own." She paused, wiping away a tear. "But if you're listening, if you haven't completely forgotten about me, I could use a little help. Just a sign that I'm not invisible. That's all I'm asking for." The thunder answered, a deep boom that shook the windows. Thomas meowed from the porch, and Evelyn got up to let him in. The cat settled on her lap, purring contentedly as she stroked his fur. Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the desert in brief, brilliant flashes. The wind howled around the corners of the trailer, and rain drummed against the metal roof like thousands of tiny fingers tapping out a lonely melody. Evelyn watched the storm through her small window, remembering how her mother used to say that big storms meant God was doing some spring cleaning in heaven. She smiled at the memory, even as another tear slipped down her cheek. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 12:55 a.m., its red numbers a steady pulse in the darkness. In the distance, the neon signs of Ruby's Diner glowed through the rain like a lighthouse, marking the place where she'd spend another day tomorrow, serving coffee and pie to strangers who looked right through her. But for now, in the quiet of her trailer with Thomas purring on her lap and the storm raging outside, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the weight of her loneliness, to acknowledge the empty spaces in her life that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. She didn't know it yet, but the storm marking this night was more than just weather. It was the prelude to change, the first notes of a symphony that would transform her life in ways she couldn't imagine. But for now, she simply sat in the darkness, listening to the rain and holding on to a hope so fragile it felt like it might shatter at any moment. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Thomas pressed himself tighter against her leg. "It's okay," she whispered, though whether she was reassuring the cat or herself, she wasn't sure. "We're okay." As the storm continued to rage outside, Evelyn finally lay down, pulling her worn quilt up to her chin. The familiar patterns of rain and thunder eventually lulled her toward sleep, even as her earlier prayer echoed in her mind. She drifted off to the sound of the desert storm, unaware that sometimes the biggest changes come when we least expect them, wrapped in the dark cloth of a midnight storm. The next evening brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the weather had grown more intense, with wind that howled like a wounded animal and rain that fell in thick, heavy sheets. Through the diner's wide windows, Evelyn watched lightning split the sky into jagged pieces, counting the seconds until thunder shook the building's foundation. Ruby's Diner stood empty, except for Evelyn. Her manager had left early, citing the weather, and her coworker Sarah had called in sick. The clock above the counter showed 11:15, Just 45 minutes until closing. The red neon "Open" sign flickered weakly against the darkness, its light creating wavering patterns on the rain-slicked parking lot. Evelyn wiped down tables that were already clean, just to keep her hands busy. The storm made her nervous, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the wind rattled the windows, or how the electricity kept threatening to give out, making the fluorescent lights stutter and buzz. The bell above the door jingled, startling her so badly she dropped her cleaning rag. Cold air and rain gusted in, along with a man who seemed to bring the storm's darkness with him. He stood just inside the doorway, water running off his leather jacket in rivulets. Tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of presence that seemed to fill the entire diner. Tattoos covered his hands and crept up his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. His knuckles were torn and bleeding, and a fresh cut above his eye leaked a thin line of blood down his temple. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Everything about this man screamed danger, from his scarred face to the way he held himself, like someone used to violence. But there was something else in his stance, too, a weariness that spoke of exhaustion, bone-deep and absolute. We're still open, she managed to say, her voice barely carrying across the empty diner. The man nodded once, moving toward the counter. He walked with a slight limp, though he seemed to be trying to hide it. As he settled onto a stool, Evelyn noticed more details, the way his hands shook slightly, the pallor beneath his tan, the haunted look in his eyes that reminded her of wounded animals she'd sometimes find in her yard. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. It was fresh. She'd just made it for herself. Another nod. She grabbed a clean mug and the pot, along with a hand towel from beneath the counter. Setting both in front of him, she tried not to stare at his injuries. "The towel's clean," she said softly. For your face." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with eyes so blue they seemed to glow in his weathered face. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough like gravel. Evelyn poured his coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Some of the hot liquid splashed over the rim of the cup. "Sorry," she whispered, reaching for a napkin to clean up the spill. "You don't belong here," he muttered, watching her hands shake. The words stung, even though she'd heard variations of them before. Usually from customers who thought she was too fat to be waiting tables, or too plain to be working where people could see her. She felt her cheeks grow hot with shame. It's the only place that'll have me," she admitted, not sure why she was telling this dangerous stranger something so personal. A dark chuckle escaped him, though there was no real humor in it. "Then maybe we're both the unwanted kind." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed immediately by thunder that made the cups rattle in their saucers. The man picked up the towel and pressed it to his bleeding temple, then took a long drink of coffee. His hands were still shaking. Evelyn should have been frightened, should have called the police, or at least kept her distance. But something in the way he held himself, in the exhaustion that seemed to weigh on him like a physical thing, touched that part of her that could never turn away from suffering. "Let me help," she said, moving around the counter before she could think better of it. She kept a first aid kit in her purse, had learned to carry one after years of minor kitchen burns and cuts. He watched her warily as she approached, but didn't stop her when she gently took the towel from his hand. The cut wasn't as bad as it had looked at first, but it needed cleaning. "I'm Evelyn," she said, dabbing at the wound with an antiseptic wipe. He flinched slightly but held still. "Luke," he replied after a long moment. "Luke Ryder." She worked in silence after that, cleaning his cut and the torn knuckles on both hands. His skin was cold to the touch, and she could feel him trembling despite his obvious attempts to control it. Just as she was finishing, Luke's eyes rolled back in his head, and he started to slump forward. Evelyn caught him before he could fall, supporting his weight against her shoulder. His skin felt like ice through his wet clothes. "Luke," she patted his cheek gently. "Luke, can you hear me?" He mumbled something incoherent but didn't fully wake. Evelyn looked at the storm outside, then back at the unconscious man leaning against her. She couldn't leave him here, and she couldn't call an ambulance. Something told her that would only make things worse. Making a decision that went against every bit of common sense she possessed, Evelyn managed to get Luke's arm over her shoulder. He was heavy, but years of carrying loaded trays had given her more strength than most people expected. Somehow she got him to his feet and half carried, half dragged him to her car. An old Buick that had seen better days but still ran reliably. The rain soaked them both in the short distance from the diner to the car. After making sure Luke was secure in the passenger seat, Evelyn ran back to lock up the diner, then climbed behind the wheel. Lightning illuminated the parking lot in stark flashes as she started the engine. "Lord," she whispered, "I hope I'm not making a terrible mistake." The drive to her trailer was slow and treacherous through the storm, but Evelyn managed it, stealing glances at her unconscious passenger whenever lightning lit up the car's interior. Luke hadn't stirred once during the drive, his head resting against the window, face pale in the darkness. By the time she pulled up to her trailer, the rain had somehow gotten even heavier. Getting Luke inside was a struggle that left her gasping for breath, but she managed it, settling him on her small couch. Thomas, her cat, watched from the safety of the bedroom doorway, tail puffed up to twice its normal size. "It's okay, Thomas," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. She had just brought a strange, injured man into her home, a man who was clearly running from something or someone. But as she looked at Luke's unconscious form, at the way pain lined his face even in sleep, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside her small trailer, Evelyn began the task of tending to her unexpected guest, not knowing that this night would mark the beginning of a change in both their lives. Morning crept into Evelyn's trailer through threadbare curtains, painting stripes of gold across Luke's face. He stirred on the narrow couch, his large frame having barely fit on its worn cushions. For a moment, confusion clouded his features as his eyes flickered open, then widened with sudden recognition. He sat up quickly, too quickly, and winced, pressing a hand to his bandaged temple. The events of the previous night came rushing back, the storm, the diner, the gentle hands that had tended his wounds. Shame washed over him as he took in his surroundings, the modest but tidy trailer, family photos on the walls, a fat orange cat watching him suspiciously from atop a bookshelf. "You're awake." Evelyn's soft voice came from the small kitchen area, where she stood in front of the stove. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. "How's your head feeling?" Luke swung his feet to the floor, already reaching for his jacket. "I shouldn't be here. I've caused enough trouble." "Nonsense," Evelyn said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she flipped a pancake. "You haven't eaten, and those wounds need checking. Breakfast is almost ready." He opened his mouth to protest, but found himself sinking back onto the couch instead. Maybe it was the genuine concern in her voice, or maybe just the exhaustion still weighing on his bones, but he couldn't find the strength to argue. "Why'd you help me?" he asked finally, his voice rough. "You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous." Evelyn turned from the stove, meeting his eyes steadily. "Everyone deserves kindness, Mr. Ryder, even if they think they don't." A few minutes later, they sat at her small kitchen table, plates loaded with pancakes, bacon, and eggs. Luke couldn't remember the last time he'd had a home-cooked meal. The food smelled amazing, but guilt made it hard to swallow. "I just got out of prison," he said abruptly, setting down his fork. 3 days ago, 8 years inside for assault." He watched her face carefully, waiting for the fear, the judgment, the inevitable request for him to leave. But Evelyn just poured more coffee into his cup. "And now you're out, starting fresh." Luke gave a bitter laugh. "People don't forgive men like me, ma'am. They don't forget." "God forgives," she said quietly, buttering another pancake. "And sometimes, that's enough to start with." Something in her voice, not pity but understanding, made Luke's throat tight. He focused on his plate, unable to meet her eyes. Later that morning, Evelyn insisted on driving Luke back to the diner to retrieve his motorcycle. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that reflected the bright Nevada sky. Luke's bike stood where he'd left it, water beading on its chrome. "Come in for lunch later," Evelyn said as he checked the bike over. "The special's meatloaf on Thursdays." Luke nodded, though they both knew he shouldn't. But at 2 o'clock, he found himself back at Ruby's Diner, sitting in a corner booth with a clear view of the counter where Evelyn worked. The afternoon crowd was thin. A few locals, some truckers, stopped for coffee. Luke nursed his third cup, watching Evelyn move between tables with practiced ease. She had a kind word for everyone, a gentle smile that somehow made the tired diner feel warmer. Then the bell jingled, and a heavy-set trucker stumbled in, already drunk despite the early hour. He dropped heavily onto a stool at the counter, leering at Evelyn as she approached with a menu. "Well, if it ain't the diner cow," he slurred, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still waddling around serving up slop?" The diner went quiet. Luke's hands tightened around his coffee cup, knuckles white. Evelyn's smile never wavered, though her cheeks flushed red. "What can I get you today, sir?" "How about you move your fat ass so I can see the specials board?" The trucker guffawed at his own joke, looking around for approval that didn't come. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Luke was across the diner in 3 long strides. His hand gripped the back of the trucker's head, and before anyone could react, he slammed the man's face down into his empty plate. The sound of breaking ceramic mixed with the trucker's startled cry. "Apologize," Luke growled, holding the struggling man down. "Now." I'm sorry," the trucker wheezed, blood streaming from his nose. Luke released him, stepping back as the trucker staggered to his feet, but the wail of approaching sirens already filled the air. Someone had called the police. "Luke," Evelyn whispered, reaching for his arm. "Run, please." But he just shook off his jacket and handed it to her, a sad smile touching his lips. "No more running." The police burst through the door moments later, weapons drawn. Luke put his hands up slowly, dropping to his knees without being told. As they cuffed him, he caught Evelyn's eye one last time. She stood in the doorway of Ruby's Diner, clutching his leather jacket to her chest as the police car pulled away. The jacket smelled of motor oil and leather, still warm from his body. Her heart pounded with a strange mixture of fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Rain began to fall again, soft and steady, but Evelyn didn't move. She stayed there long after the police car had disappeared, the weight of Luke's jacket in her arms feeling somehow like both an ending and a beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ruby's Diner as Evelyn paced outside the county jail. Her fingers nervously counted the worn bills in her purse for the 10th time. $287, her entire emergency fund. The bail clerk had told her Luke's bail was set at $300. She'd spent the night tossing and turning, his jacket still draped over her kitchen chair. The memory of him being led away in handcuffs haunted her. Nobody had ever stood up for her like that before. The courthouse opened at 8 o'clock sharp. Evelyn's hands trembled as she pushed through the heavy doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she approached the bail window, where a tired-looking clerk barely glanced up from her computer. "I'm here about Luke Ryder," Evelyn said softly. "I want to post his bail." The clerk raised an eyebrow. $300. Evelyn placed her stack of bills on the counter, then dug through her purse for loose change. Quarters, dimes, and nickels clinked against the scratched counter until she had exactly $300. The clerk counted it twice, lips pursed. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into a back office. Evelyn's heart pounded as she waited. What was she doing? She barely knew this man. But something in his eyes, in the gentle way he'd spoken to her despite his rough exterior, told her this was right. 30 minutes later, Luke emerged from the holding area, looking disheveled but somehow smaller than before. His eyes widened when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Paying your bail," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. Luke's face darkened. He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but urgently, and led her outside into the morning sun. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I'm not worth your money." "Because," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, "no one ever helped me." The words hung between them, heavy with years of loneliness and rejection. Luke's grip on her arm loosened, his expression softening. "Come on," she said, gesturing to her car. "I'll drive you back to your bike." The ride to the diner was silent, but not uncomfortable. Luke kept stealing glances at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle. When they arrived, he didn't immediately get out. "I can't pay you back right away," he said finally. "I know. I might never be able to. I know that too." That evening, after her shift ended, Evelyn found Luke waiting outside her trailer. He'd cleaned up, shaved, though his knuckles were still scabbed. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another desert storm. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the wooden steps of her trailer. Evelyn nodded, settling beside him. They watched the storm approach, lightning flickering in the distance. Thunder rolled across the desert like God clearing his throat. "Thank you," Luke said quietly, "for believing in me when you had no reason to." Something in his voice broke something in her. Before she could stop them, tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know what it's like," she whispered, "when everyone's given up on you." Luke turned to her, concern etching his features. "What do you mean?" Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "The doctors told me years ago I can't have children. Something wrong with my body. I've prayed and prayed, but—" She drew a shaky breath. "God must have closed that door for a reason." Luke was quiet for a long moment, watching the storm draw closer. Then he turned to her, his eyes impossibly gentle. "Maybe miracles don't care what doctors say." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. All the loneliness, all the yearning for connection, all the desperate hope for second chances, it crystallized in that moment. Luke's hand found hers, rough palm against soft skin. The first fat raindrops began to fall as their lips met. The kiss was gentle at first, then hungry with need and comfort and longing. Lightning crackled overhead as they stumbled inside, leaving the storm to rage outside. 3 days later, Evelyn was halfway through her morning shift when the nausea hit. She barely made it to the employee bathroom before emptying her stomach. Her coworker Jenny held her hair back. You okay, honey? Jenny asked, concern in her voice. Must be something I ate, Evelyn mumbled, but a strange suspicion was already forming. On her break, she drove to the drugstore, hands shaking as she purchased a pregnancy test. Back at the diner, she locked herself in the bathroom, following the instructions with trembling fingers. 2 minutes felt like 2 hours. When she finally looked at the stick, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. 2 pink lines. Clear as day. Evelyn's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold tile wall, staring at the impossible result in her hands. Tears blurred her vision as joy and disbelief warred in her chest. It's a miracle, she whispered to the empty bathroom, one hand pressed against her stomach. It's really a miracle. Outside, the Nevada sun blazed in a cloudless sky, as if God himself was smiling down on the little diner where impossible things suddenly seemed possible. Evelyn's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she drove home from the diner. The pregnancy test, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, sat in her purse like a precious treasure. Her heart fluttered with each bump in the road, still unable to fully grasp the reality of what was happening. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert, painting her small trailer in shades of gold. As she pulled up, she noticed Luke's motorcycle parked outside. He'd promised to fix some things around her place while she was at work. The sight of it made her heart skip a beat. Walking up the creaky steps, she could hear the sound of tools clinking inside. She opened the door to find Luke hunched over her old kitchen chair, concentration etched on his face as he tightened a loose joint. The sight was so domestic, so normal, it brought tears to her eyes. Luke looked up at the sound of her entrance, his face softening into a smile. "You're home early?" he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Then he noticed her expression. "Evelyn? What's wrong?" She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her hand clutched her purse tighter, the pregnancy test inside feeling like it might burn through the fabric. "I'm pregnant," she finally blurted out. The wrench in Luke's hand clattered to the floor. He stared at her, mouth slightly open, frozen in place. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "What did you say?" he whispered. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I took a test at work. 2 lines, clear as day." Luke's face went through a cascade of emotions: shock, disbelief, wonder. Then, to Evelyn's surprise, tears began rolling down his weathered cheeks. He made no move to wipe them away, just let them fall freely. "Then God hasn't given up on me yet," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Evelyn crossed the room in 3 quick steps, and Luke rose to meet her. They came together in a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping around her like he never wanted to let go. She could feel his tears dampening her shoulder, matching her own. "A baby," he murmured into her hair. "Our baby." They stood like that for a long while, swaying slightly, both too overwhelmed to speak. The setting sun streamed through the window, bathing them in warm light. It felt like a blessing, like a divine hand reaching down to touch their little trailer in the desert. Finally, Luke pulled back enough to look at her face, his hands gently cupping her cheeks. "I don't deserve this," he said softly. "I don't deserve you." "Stop that," Evelyn said firmly, placing her hand over his. "You deserve every bit of happiness that comes your way. We both do." They spent the next hour sitting on her small couch, talking about the future, making plans, dreaming dreams they'd never dared to dream before. Luke's hand kept straying to her stomach, though there was nothing to feel yet. His touch was reverent, like he was handling something sacred. As evening settled over the desert, Luke's phone rang, shattering their peaceful bubble. Evelyn watched as he checked the number, his face instantly draining of color. He stood quickly, moving to the kitchen before answering. "Yeah?" he said, his voice tight. Evelyn could hear a gravelly voice on the other end, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever was being said made Luke's shoulders tense, his free hand clenching into a fist. "That was a long time ago," he growled into the phone. "I'm not that person anymore." More gravelly words. Luke's knuckles went white. "You can't just—" he started, but the voice cut him off. Luke listened for another minute, his jaw clenching tighter with each passing second. "I'll think about it," he finally said, and hung up. "Who was that?" Evelyn asked, worry creeping into her voice. Luke turned back to her, his expression carefully neutral. "Just an old friend," he said, but his eyes told a different story. They were haunted, filled with a fear she'd never seen in them before. "Luke," she said softly, "don't lie to me, not now." He ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly tired. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow." Evelyn wanted to press further, but something in his expression made her hold back. Instead, she stood and took his hand, leading him to her bedroom. They'd been sharing her bed for the past few days, finding comfort in each other's presence. As they lay in the darkness, Evelyn took Luke's large hand and placed it over her still flat belly. "We'll make this work," she promised. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Luke pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Together," he repeated, but his voice held a note of uncertainty that made her heart ache. In the distance, a motorcycle engine revved, the sound carrying clearly through the desert night. Luke's entire body tensed at the noise, his arm tightening protectively around Evelyn. The sound faded away, leaving only the whisper of wind through the desert sage and the quiet breathing of two people holding each other in the dark, one miracle cradled between them, while unseen shadows gathered on the horizon. The desert sun cast long shadows across the gravel parking lot of Joe's Auto Repair as Luke wiped grease from his hands. The elderly owner, Joe Martinez, had taken one look at Luke's prison record, shrugged, and said, "Everyone deserves a second chance, son. Just don't make me regret it." That had been 2 weeks ago. Now Luke found himself settling into a routine he'd never imagined possible. Honest work, a steady paycheck, and evenings spent with Evelyn in their own little piece of paradise. He glanced at his watch, 4:30 in the afternoon. Joe emerged from his office, keys jingling. "Lock up when you're done with that transmission, will you?" Joe asked, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "And don't forget to set the alarm this time." Luke nodded, grateful for the trust. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure everything's secure." After Joe left, Luke finished the transmission work, his mind wandering to Evelyn. She'd been different lately, glowing, really. The morning sickness was still there, but it didn't dim the joy that seemed to radiate from her very being. When he got home that evening, the smell of pot roast greeted him before he even opened the door. Inside their small trailer, Evelyn stood at the tiny kitchen counter, humming as she chopped vegetables. "Something smells amazing," Luke said, coming up behind her and kissing her cheek. "Just a simple pot roast," she replied, but her smile showed how much his appreciation meant. "How was work?" "Good. Joe's teaching me about hybrid engines next week." He paused, watching as she moved around the kitchen with a newfound grace. "You look beautiful today." Evelyn blushed, one hand unconsciously touching her stomach. There wasn't much to see yet, but they both knew what miracle was growing there. After dinner, Evelyn led him to the corner of the trailer she'd been working on all week. The space wasn't large, but she'd managed to transform it into something special. A small crib, second-hand but freshly painted, white, stood against the wall. Above it hung a mobile with little fabric stars and moons. "I know it's early," she said softly, "but I couldn't help myself. The crib was on sale at the thrift store, and Martha from the diner helped me carry it home." Luke ran his hand along the crib's smooth railing, throat tight with emotion. "It's perfect," he managed. That Sunday morning found them sitting in the back pew of First Grace Church, both feeling slightly out of place among the regular congregation. Evelyn wore her best dress, a flowing blue number that made her eyes shine. Luke had put on a clean button-down shirt and combed his hair, though nothing could hide the tattoos that crept up his neck. Pastor Jim stood at the pulpit, his gentle voice carrying through the small church. "Today, we're going to talk about forgiveness," he began. "Not just receiving it, but accepting that we deserve it." Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Evelyn reached over and squeezed his hand. "Redemption," Pastor Jim continued, "requires truth. We cannot truly be forgiven, by others or ourselves, until we face our past with honesty and courage." The words hit Luke like physical blows. Truth. His mind wandered to the phone call from Mitch, to the debt he hadn't told Evelyn about. The pastor's words seemed aimed directly at him. Redemption requires truth. After the service, Pastor Jim approached them with a warm smile. "I'm glad to see you both here," he said, shaking their hands. "You're always welcome in God's house." That evening, as the desert sky turned purple with sunset, Evelyn suggested they pray together. Luke hesitated but nodded, taking her hands in his as they sat on their small couch. Evelyn closed her eyes. "Dear God," she began, her voice soft but steady, "thank you for all the blessings you've given us. Thank you for Luke, for this home, and most of all," her voice caught slightly, "thank you for the life growing inside me that I was told I could never have. Thank you for proving that miracles still happen." Luke kept his eyes closed, but a tear escaped, rolling down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but Evelyn had seen. She reached up and touched his face gently. "Your turn," she whispered. Luke cleared his throat. "God," he said roughly, I don't know how to do this right, but thank you for Evelyn. Thank you for giving a man like me a chance at—" He paused, struggling with the words. "At redemption." They sat in silence after the prayer, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the desert in gold. The small trailer felt different somehow, blessed despite its cramped quarters and worn furniture. Evelyn had placed a vase of desert wildflowers on the kitchen table, their bright colors a testament to beauty surviving in harsh places. "I've been thinking about names," Evelyn said later as they prepared for bed. "What do you think about Grace if it's a girl?" Luke looked at her, remembering Pastor Jim's words about Grace being given, not earned. "Grace," he repeated softly. "It's perfect." That night, as Evelyn slept peacefully beside him, Luke lay awake, Pastor Jim's words echoing in his mind. Redemption requires truth. He looked at Evelyn's peaceful face in the moonlight, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, even in sleep. The weight of his unspoken truth pressed against his chest like a physical burden. He thought about the life growing inside her, their miracle child. He thought about the darkness from his past, threatening to overshadow their future. The choice loomed before him. Continue hiding the truth and risk everything, or be honest and possibly lose it all. Luke reached out and gently touched Evelyn's hand where it rested on her stomach. She smiled in her sleep, and his heart clenched with love and fear in equal measure. Whatever choice he made, he knew one thing for certain. He would do anything to protect them both. The Nevada summer was in full swing when Evelyn noticed her uniforms getting tighter. Standing in front of her small bathroom mirror one morning, she smoothed her hands over the gentle swell of her belly, barely visible but unmistakably there. A smile tugged at her lips as she remembered all the mornings she'd stood in this same spot, praying for this very miracle. At the diner, the change didn't go unnoticed. Sarah, one of the waitresses who used to whisper about Evelyn's weight behind her back, was the first to spot it during the morning rush. "Oh my goodness," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes wide. "Evelyn, you're showing!" Before Evelyn could respond, 3 other waitresses crowded around her, their hands reaching out to touch her small bump. The very women who had once mocked her size now cooed and fussed over her like mother hens. "How far along are you now? Have you had any morning sickness? Do you think it's a boy or a girl?" Ruby watched from behind the counter, trying to hide her own smile. The gruff diner owner had always had a soft spot for Evelyn, though she rarely showed it. Now she found herself slipping extra slices of fresh-baked apple pie onto Evelyn's plate during breaks. "Can't have that baby going hungry," Ruby would grumble when Evelyn tried to protest. "Besides, these pies aren't going to eat themselves." Across town at Pete's garage, Luke was experiencing his own transformation. The other mechanics noticed how he'd start humming while working on engines, something they'd never heard before. His hands, still scarred but steady, moved with newfound gentleness over the machines he fixed. Pete, the shop owner, caught Luke grinning one afternoon while rebuilding a Harley's transmission. The older man shook his head in amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete chuckled, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "Didn't think a biker could look that happy. Fatherhood suits you, Luke." Luke ducked his head, but couldn't hide his smile. "Never thought I'd get the chance," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes I wake up thinking it's all been a dream." "Ain't no dream, son," Pete clapped him on the shoulder. "You've earned this second chance, don't waste it." That evening, Luke drove home early from the garage with a surprise tucked in the bed of his pickup truck. Evelyn was still at work, giving him time to prepare. He carried 2 cans of paint and supplies to the front of their trailer, where the old door had grown rusty and faded over the years. The desert sun beat down as he sanded away the old paint, his t-shirt growing damp with sweat. He thought about how Evelyn's eyes lit up every time she saw something sky blue, her favorite color. She'd mentioned once how it reminded her of endless possibilities. Luke was just finishing the second coat when Evelyn's car pulled up. She stepped out, still in her diner uniform, and stopped short at the sight of their trailer door gleaming fresh and bright against the desert backdrop. "Luke," she breathed, walking closer. "It's beautiful." He set down his paintbrush, suddenly shy. "Thought you might like a little color around here." Evelyn reached out to touch the door, careful not to smudge the wet paint. "It's exactly the right shade," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How did you know?" "I pay attention," he said simply, pulling her close. The old radio on their porch was playing a classic country song, its melody drifting out into the desert evening. Without warning, Luke took Evelyn's hand and spun her gently. She laughed in surprise as he pulled her into a slow dance, right there in front of their freshly painted door. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as they swayed together, their shadows stretching long across the sand. "I never thought I could be this happy," Evelyn confessed, resting her head against his chest. Luke kissed the top of her head. "Me neither, sweetheart. Me neither." They danced until the stars began to appear, laughing like children when Luke attempted an awkward twirl. Their joy echoed across the desert, pure and unrestrained, as if all the years of loneliness were being washed away by this simple moment of shared happiness. The next morning found them in the waiting room of Desert Springs Medical Center. Evelyn fidgeted nervously with her purse strap, while Luke pretended to read a magazine, though his eyes hadn't moved from the same page for 15 minutes. "Evelyn May?" a nurse called, leading them to the ultrasound room. The technician was friendly, making small talk as she prepared the equipment. "This is exciting," she said, spreading gel on Evelyn's rounded belly. "Let's see how your little one is doing." The room filled with a rapid whooshing sound, their baby's heartbeat. But then the technician's brow furrowed in concentration. She moved the wand slightly, and a second whooshing sound joined the first, slightly out of sync. "Well," the technician said, her face breaking into a broad smile. "Looks like we have a surprise here." "Is everything okay?" Evelyn asked, gripping Luke's hand tightly. "Everything's perfect," the technician assured them. "You're having twins." The word hung in the air for a moment, as both Evelyn and Luke tried to process it. "Twins?" Luke repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, and I can tell you the genders if you'd like," the technician offered. When they nodded, still stunned, she continued, "You're having a boy and a girl." Evelyn burst into tears, happy sobs shaking her body as Luke gathered her in his arms. Through her tears, she whispered, "2 miracles. God gave us 2 miracles." Luke held her close, his own eyes wet with tears he didn't try to hide. On the screen, their babies moved and shifted, 2 tiny lives already proving that the impossible was possible. The technician printed several photos for them, pointing out tiny hands and feet, explaining how the twins were developing. But Evelyn and Luke could hardly focus on her words, too overwhelmed by the magnitude of their blessing. Later, as they walked to their car hand in hand, Evelyn stopped and turned to Luke. "2 babies," she said softly, placing his hand on her belly. "Can you believe it?" Luke shook his head, his throat too tight for words. He remembered his prayer in church, asking for redemption. Now here he was, blessed not once but twice, given a chance to be the father he never thought he could be. The perfect bubble of happiness that had surrounded Evelyn and Luke began to crack one Tuesday afternoon. Luke was at work in Mike's garage, his hands deep in the engine of an old Chevrolet, when he heard the distinctive rumble of multiple motorcycles approaching. His heart stopped. He knew those engines, had worked on some of them himself, back in the days he tried so hard to forget. Through the open garage door, he watched 3 bikes pull up, their chrome gleaming in the harsh desert sun. Mitch the Viper Laird dismounted first, his leather vest displaying the colors Luke had once worn with pride. The gang leader's smile was cold as winter as he approached. "Well, look who's playing mechanic," Mitch drawled, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. "Almost didn't recognize you without your colors, brother." Luke wiped his hands slowly on a rag, buying time to steady his voice. "I'm not your brother anymore, Mitch. That life's behind me." "Is it now?" Mitch's eyes narrowed. "Heard you've been busy? Got yourself a woman? Maybe even a kid on the way?" He picked up a wrench from the workbench, turning it over in his hands. "Shame if anything happened to them." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Luke's fingers tightened around the rag until his knuckles went white. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Mitch set the wrench down with careful precision. "One job, that's all. You still owe us for keeping quiet about Denver." Luke's stomach churned at the mention of Denver, the night that had landed him in prison, the debt he thought he'd paid with time, served. "I don't do that anymore," Luke said firmly, though his hands were trembling. Mitch stepped closer, close enough that Luke could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath. "You don't have a choice. One job, or maybe I pay a visit to that pretty little diner where your girl works." Luke's world tilted sideways. Images flashed through his mind. Evelyn's gentle smile, her hand resting protectively over their growing babies, the way she hummed while making breakfast. He couldn't let them near her. "You have 24 hours to decide," Mitch said, already turning to leave. "Choose wisely, brother." The motorcycles roared away, leaving Luke standing in the garage with his heart pounding and his mind racing. He finished his shift in a daze, his thoughts churning with desperate plans. When he got home that evening, Evelyn was sitting on their small porch, her face glowing with joy. "Feel this," she said, grabbing his hand and placing it on her belly. "They're kicking up a storm today." Luke felt the tiny movements under his palm, and his resolve crystallized. He had to protect them, all three of them, no matter the cost. "We need to leave," he said abruptly. Evelyn's smile faded. "What?" Luke paced the small space of their trailer, running his hands through his hair. "Pack whatever you can carry. We'll drive through the night, head somewhere they can't find us." "Luke," Evelyn said slowly, "you're scaring me. What's happening?" He couldn't meet her eyes as he told her about the visit from his old gang, about the threat hanging over their heads. When he finished, the trailer was silent except for the hum of the ancient air conditioner. Finally, Evelyn stood up, her face set with determination. "We're not running." "Evelyn, please." "No," she said firmly. "We've come this far by faith. God didn't give us these miracles just to have us spend our lives looking over our shoulders." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Whatever this is, we face it together. That's what family does." Luke felt tears burning behind his eyes. She believed in him so completely, trusted him so fully. But she didn't know the whole truth about Denver, about the darkness he still carried inside. That night, he watched her pack a small suitcase, just in case they needed to leave quickly. She moved around their tiny home with quiet efficiency, folding clothes and gathering important papers. Every few minutes, she would pause to rub her growing belly, whispering soft words of comfort to their babies. Luke's heart felt like it was being torn in two. He knew what he had to do. After Evelyn fell asleep, he sat at their small kitchen table and wrote the hardest words of his life. "My dearest Evelyn, I'd rather they take me than touch you. You and our babies deserve better than a life on the run. Know that I love you more than I ever thought possible. You showed me what grace looks like." He placed his hand gently on her belly one last time, feeling their babies move beneath his palm. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Taking only his jacket and what little cash they had, Luke slipped out into the desert night. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain. He walked away from the only real home he'd ever known, each step feeling like a knife in his heart. When Evelyn woke at dawn, she immediately knew something was wrong. The bed beside her was cold and empty. She found his note on the kitchen table and read it through tears that wouldn't stop falling. Running outside into the blowing sand, she called his name until her voice was raw. "Luke, please don't do this. Luke!" But only the desert wind answered, whipping her nightgown around her legs and carrying away her cries. She stood there until the sun rose fully over the horizon, one hand pressed against her belly where their babies kicked and moved, unaware that their father was gone. Finally, shivering despite the growing heat, Evelyn walked back inside their trailer. The door, still that perfect shade of sky blue, closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like goodbye. The calendar pages turned slowly as Evelyn went through the motions of living without Luke. Each morning, she pulled herself out of bed, touched the sky-blue door he had painted, and whispered a prayer for his safety. Her growing belly became both comfort and reminder. Life moving forward even when her heart felt stuck in place. At the diner, she worked shorter shifts now, her feet swelling in her sensible shoes. The same women who had once whispered cruel jokes about her size now hovered around her like protective mother hens. Ruby, the diner's owner, kept a close eye on her from behind the counter. "You're pushing yourself too hard, honey," Ruby would say, pressing extra food into her hands. "Those babies need their mama strong." Martha from the early shift brought over casseroles 3 times a week. "Can't have you standing at the stove in your condition," she'd insist, her eyes soft with concern. Sarah, the youngest waitress, spent her breaks helping Evelyn organize the nursery corner in her trailer, folding tiny clothes and arranging stuffed animals. The ladies had even organized a baby shower, filling her small home with presents and hope. Evelyn sat in the middle of it all, touching each gift with trembling fingers, fighting back tears at their kindness. "We're your family now," Ruby had declared, and the others nodded firmly. "Those babies are going to have more aunties than they know what to do with." 34 weeks into her pregnancy, the weather turned volatile. Dark clouds gathered over the desert, just like the night Luke had first stumbled into her life. Evelyn was clearing tables when the first rumble of thunder shook the diner's windows. A sharp pain squeezed her middle, making her gasp and grab the counter. Ruby was at her side instantly. "Evelyn, what is it, honey?" "Just a twinge," she tried to smile, but another contraction hit harder. Her eyes widened with fear. "It's too soon!" Lightning split the sky as Ruby helped her to a chair. The storm intensified, rain hammering against the roof while Martha called the hospital. The wind howled so fiercely it drowned out their voices. "Roads are flooding," Sarah announced, hanging up the phone. "Emergency services can't get through for at least an hour." Evelyn clutched her belly as another contraction ripped through her. "The babies aren't waiting an hour." Ruby took charge, her voice steady despite the panic in her eyes. "Sarah, get the first aid kit and all the clean towels you can find. Martha, boil water. We're having these babies right here." They helped Evelyn to the back room where they kept extra supplies. Lightning flashed through the small window, casting strange shadows as they worked. Martha, who had been a nurse before retiring to waitressing, took the lead. "Just like riding a bicycle," she said with forced cheerfulness, laying out supplies, though usually with more doctors and fewer napkin dispensers. Hours blurred together as Evelyn labored. The storm raged outside while inside, the women formed a circle of strength around her. They wiped her forehead, held her hands, and prayed with her between contractions. "You can do this, honey," Ruby kept saying. "You're the strongest person I know." Finally, just as lightning cracked so close it made the lights flicker, the first baby slid into Martha's waiting hands. A tiny cry pierced the air. "It's a girl," Martha announced, quickly wrapping the infant in clean towels. "And here comes her brother." Minutes later, 2 perfect, tiny babies lay against Evelyn's chest, their cries mixing with the sound of rain and their mother's tears of joy. Despite being early, they were surprisingly strong, their little fingers gripping whatever they could reach. "Grace," Evelyn whispered, touching her daughter's dark hair. "And Ryder." She looked at her son, seeing Luke's strength in his small features. The storm began to ease as dawn approached. Emergency services finally arrived, checking over mother and babies before transporting them to the hospital. The doctors were amazed at how well the twins were doing, calling them little fighters. Later that day, lying in her hospital bed with her babies sleeping nearby, Evelyn touched each of their tiny faces. "You'll know your daddy someday," she promised softly. "He gave us the greatest gift of all. He showed us that miracles still happen, even when you've stopped believing in them." Outside her window, the storm clouds parted, revealing a sky as blue as her trailer door. The color of hope, of new beginnings, of grace. 6 weeks had melted into a gentle rhythm of midnight feedings and early morning cuddles. Evelyn's trailer, once a symbol of her loneliness, now echoed with the soft sounds of babies cooing and the steady creak of her rocking chair. She'd draped Luke's old leather jacket across the back of the chair, its familiar scent fading but still bringing comfort during those quiet moments between sleep and waking. The twins were growing stronger every day. Grace had Luke's determined spirit, fighting to hold her head up first. Little Ryder had inherited his mother's gentle soul, content to watch the world with wide, wondering eyes. Together they filled her world with a joy she'd never thought possible. At the diner, Ruby had set up a makeshift nursery in the break room, complete with 2 second-hand cribs. The regular customers would peek in between bites of pie, cooing at the babies and leaving extra-large tips for the little angels. That afternoon, the diner was unusually quiet. The desert sun painted long shadows across the worn linoleum floor as Evelyn wiped down tables, humming softly to herself. She'd taken to wearing Luke's jacket during her shifts, despite the heat. It made her feel closer to him, like keeping a piece of their shared dream alive. The bell above the door jingled. Something in the sound made Evelyn freeze, dish towel suspended mid-wipe. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the way the afternoon light suddenly seemed different, but her heart began to race before she even turned around. There, framed in the doorway like a figure from a dream, stood a tall man. His face bore the same scars she remembered, but something was different. His eyes, once haunted by shadows, now held a quiet peace she'd never seen before. Instead of his usual leather jacket, he wore a simple black coat that looked remarkably like a preacher's. "Luke," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. He took a step forward, and she noticed he was holding something, a small, worn Bible. The afternoon sun caught the gold cross on its cover, making it gleam. "Evelyn." His voice was softer than she remembered, touched with a tremor of emotion. She didn't move, couldn't move, afraid he might disappear if she did. The dish towel slipped from her fingers, landing silently on the floor. "I turned myself in," he continued, taking another careful step. "The day I left, went straight to the police station and told them everything about the gang, about Mitch, about all of it. The few customers in the diner had gone completely still, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips, watching the scene unfold. "They're all in custody now," Luke said. "The whole operation's shut down. But that's not the important part." He glanced down at the Bible in his hands. "I found something in the prison chapel, something I never knew I was looking for." Tears were streaming down Evelyn's face now, but she barely noticed them. "I'm free, Ev." His voice broke on the words. "Really free. Not just from prison, but from everything that was holding me down. And he swallowed hard. "I came home. If you'll still have me." The distance between them disappeared in 3 quick steps as Evelyn collapsed into his arms. The familiar strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was all exactly as she remembered. "You came home," she whispered into his shirt, feeling his arms tighten around her. "You really came home." Around them, the diner had gone quiet except for a few sniffles. Martha was openly wiping her eyes with her apron. Ruby stood in the kitchen doorway, beaming through her tears. The twins? Luke asked softly, his voice hopeful and afraid all at once. As if on cue, a small cry came from the break room. Evelyn pulled back just enough to see Luke's face, watching as wonder replaced uncertainty in his eyes. "Would you like to meet your children?" she asked, taking his hand. He nodded, unable to speak, and let her lead him toward the sound of their miracle. Not one, but two, waiting to meet their father for the first time. The afternoon sun streamed through the diner windows, turning everything golden, as a family that began with a storm on a dark night finally came together in the light of day. The weeks that followed Luke's return brought changes as gentle as morning sunlight. Each day revealed new layers of the man he'd become, like pages turning in God's own storybook. Every evening after the diner closed, Luke would arrange the chairs in a circle. Men from all walks of life, former inmates, struggling bikers, lost souls, would gather there. Their voices, once hard with anger, softened as they shared their burdens and hopes. Luke would open his worn Bible, his fingers, the same ones that once formed fists, now carefully turning delicate pages as he spoke of redemption. During the day, he transformed the garage into more than just a place for fixing engines. Young bikers would drift in, drawn by the rumor of an ex-Hell's Angel who'd found peace. Luke would work on their motorcycles while talking about second chances, his quiet words carrying the weight of lived experience. At home, Evelyn watched in wonder as Luke cradled their twins. His scarred hands, so massive against their tiny bodies, moved with impossible gentleness as he changed diapers and prepared bottles. When little Grace fussed at night, he'd pace the trailer's narrow hallway, humming old hymns until she settled. "Watch this," he'd say to Ryder, showing him how to fix a wobbly stroller wheel. The baby would gurgle, tiny fingers reaching for the tools, while Luke explained every step as if speaking to a grown mechanic. The little church where Evelyn had once poured out her lonely prayers became the setting for their wedding. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews filled with their newfound family, diner regulars, reformed bikers, and church members who'd witnessed their journey. As Evelyn walked down the aisle, she saw tears in Luke's eyes. The congregation sang "Amazing Grace" softly, their voices rising like a gentle tide of hope. After they exchanged rings, Luke pulled her close. "You gave me a reason to live?" he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "God gave us a reason to love." The desert seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book. Ruby's Diner, once just a faded stopover on a dusty highway, had become something more, a lighthouse for lost souls. Veterans with haunted eyes found peace over cups of coffee and shared stories. Bikers, their leather vests worn and weathered, gathered to hear Luke speak of redemption. Widows who'd forgotten how to smile now laughed with Evelyn as she balanced the twins on her hip while refilling their cups. Even truckers who once passed by without a second glance now stopped, drawn by whispers of the miracles that happened here. On a warm evening in September, Luke knelt beside his old motorcycle, carefully adjusting the newly attached sidecar. His hands, once instruments of anger, now worked with loving precision to ensure his children's safety. The chrome gleamed in the setting sun, reflecting the desert sky's brilliant oranges and purples. Evelyn stood on a stepladder, giving one final wipe to the diner's fresh-painted sign. "Miracles served daily," it proclaimed in bright blue letters, the same shade as hope. The twins, now 6 months old, cooed from their carrier nearby. Luke helped Evelyn down, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted of coffee and promise. They settled the babies securely in the sidecar, wrapping them snugly against the evening wind. As they rode into the sunset, Their laughter carried across the desert like music. The wide Nevada sky stretched endless above them, painted with colors only God could create. Evelyn held tight to Luke's waist, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and thought, sometimes God doesn't just open the door, He sends a storm to blow it wide. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.